I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Emma Waters.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, today, plenty of topics to talk about. We're just about 2 weeks from the election. First, Amber will be talking about Trump taking on a shift at McDonald's. Next, I'll be talking about Kamala's disastrous Bret Baier interview from last week. Emma will be talking about Elon Musk as an election integrity watchdog. And then Ben will be talking about the apparent American leak of Israeli plans to invade Iran and the leak of those plans to Iran itself. So first, we'll kick it off and go straight to Amber.
All right, thanks, Will. And yes, Trump worked the fry machine at McDonald's and sparked a million memes. It was a really fun weekend for content on the internet, but there's a couple of, I think, interesting political narratives coming out of Trump's visit to McDonald's. The first of which is that Trump is just a really good retail politician. He knows how to talk to people. He's very funny. He's clearly in on the joke when he does these kinds of things. He's not pretending to be a working class American, but he is showing respect to those people. He shows up in his normal attire, right? He's got the white shirt and the red tie with the apron on over top, and is just kind of enjoying sort of the cosplay of the whole thing. And the left freaked out about this. And I think it's because they don't have a good retail politician on their side. They're stuck with Kamala Harris. They know that her or Tim Walz could never pull off this type of campaign event. And in fact, we've seen that they are completely unable to. Tim Walz, of course, struggling to load his shotgun during that opening day pheasant hunt that suggested he was not this avid hunter as he wanted people to believe. And this led to a whole lot of attacks on both Trump and McDonald's in general. There is a Newsweek headline that came out today accusing this franchise location of failing their health standards, their health tests and inspections, which is a really good reminder that as much as you hate the media, you don't hate them enough. They are legitimately trying to cancel a small business owner because they dared to have Trump handing out fries and McFlurries to customers. There was also the entire complaint that the whole event was staged. And naturally, somebody who just survived 2 assassination attempts is not going to be standing at an open drive-through window where any unvetted, unscreened person can drive through and potentially get access to the former president. So the McDonald's was temporarily closed officially, and there were some individuals who were recommended by the franchise owner who were able to go through the drive-through and interact with Trump. And this is pretty standard for any campaign stop of this nature. The candidates don't just walk into a restaurant. There's always some kind of pre-screening that takes place. There's usually a sweep done by their security team. This is just the normal procedure for these kinds of events. There was nothing really out of the ordinary in this particular case. And then finally, Trump is highlighting the fact that Kamala Harris has still failed to produce any material evidence of the idea that she ever worked at McDonald's, which she conveniently did not start claiming until she ran for president in 2019. She repeated it, of course, during this election multiple times. And there are several reasons to think that she did not actually work at McDonald's, including the fact that contemporaneous resumes from the time never listed her employment at McDonald's. She applied for a job that required her to list all past employment. She did not put McDonald's on that application. McDonald's has said that they don't have any records from the early 80s when Kamala would have worked there. So they're not able to confirm nor deny that she was ever employed. And her story has changed several times. Initially, it was that she worked at McDonald's to pay her way through college. Then it was she just worked there briefly for a summer to get some extra spending money. So there's a lot of mismatched details, let's say, about Kamala's supposed time at the fryer. And the media keeps saying that Trump is claiming without evidence that Kamala didn't work at McDonald's, but really the burden of proof is on the Kamala campaign to prove that she ever did. It wouldn't be that difficult. She could pull up IRS, past tax returns. She could pull up her Social Security history. Both of those would show that she was working at McDonald's at the time, but they won't do it. And I think all of us probably know the reason why. So, with all of that said, this was just a brilliant campaign move. He managed to get Democrats effectively attacking people who work at McDonald's, managed to get them attacking small business owners because they dared to invite him to this McDonald's location, and brought greater attention to the fact that Kamala Harris is someone who changes her positions all the time, seemingly doesn't tell the truth about herself in any instance. I mean, she constantly says that she is an Oakland girl. She moved to Canada when she was like 2 years old. Everything about her is practically phony. So I'd love to hear what y'all think about the fry machine heard around the world with Trump's visit to that Bucks County McDonald's.
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, it was a great political theater. I mean, I love that the Democrats are like, that's staged. It's like, yeah, what a political event that is not entirely reflective of exactly the way this thing would work in real life, given that, the candidate they've tried to kill him on 2 different occasions. But the aesthetics are amazing. And the best take I saw on it was that the guy was wearing, his normal out getup, which is actually something that Trump does very well. He never panders with his outfit. He always wears the same thing. It doesn't matter what environment he's in. He's wearing a suit and tie, and a suit and a white shirt in general, almost always a red tie, except if he's like golfing. That's about the only time you see him in something different. So he never panders. And so even if he goes to McDonald's, he shows up at McDonald's in a suit and tie, takes off his jacket and puts on an apron. And the aesthetic of the man, nice, kindly man in a tie and a white shirt and an apron just goes. Somebody pointed out, like, you go to these old pictures of what shopkeepers used to look like, the honest shopkeeper who was going to give you great customer service. That's the vibe. And it was just a really impressive little bit of political theater. And he's very good at this stuff. The guy's just a natural politician. And the fact that the Democrats were mad about it was just, an example of how they just can't help themselves. Like, if you're sitting there as a Democratic advisor, if I were advising the Kamala campaign, I'd be like, we're just not going to talk about this, guys. We're not going to complain about it. We're going to answer questions and be like, if anybody asks us, we'll be like, well, sure, he can do this at McDonald's, but his agenda is bad for working class people. And then we're just going to move on. But no, they couldn't help themselves. They just can't, like, it's staged. It's not real. They weren't really open to the full public. Like, give me a break. And all you've done is just continue to recycle all these images that make people be like, oh yeah, I kind of like Trump. And I think it's really hurting them. And I guess the other point I'll make is I've seen so many people, I don't know if it was the New York Times, who said, Republicans claim without evidence that Kamala Harris didn't work at McDonald's. It's like, whoa. She hasn't corroborated her claim. And she's the one in possession of the necessary evidence to corroborate her claim. Even if she doesn't have like old W-2s or whatever, she certainly could like say, I worked at this McDonald's in this location during this year. And here's a coworker, right? Here's somebody who can attest to the fact that I was there. But she doesn't even bother doing any of that. And yet it's us who's like, whoa, because I'm sure, as you can't prove negatives. And I certainly can recall every single job I had. If you gave me like 30 minutes, I could provide corroborating evidence that at one point in my life I worked there, either in the form of testimony from coworkers or tax documents or something. And it's ridiculous that she can't and just doesn't even know where she worked.
Yeah, I think in terms of the optics of this, it's obviously brilliant, and it points to really a consistent theme since Donald Trump burst onto the political scene, which is he's the everyman billionaire. He can go in and he's just as comfortable flipping hamburgers and serving them up as he is being executive in a company or chief executive of the United States. It was very similar. You guys have probably seen, he went on Undercover Boss, I think, years back, and it was very similar. He was going to help clean rooms on that show. And first of all, you see just how well he relates to essentially the rank and file. And just like, it's always been clear that workers on construction sites, back when he was focused on real estate, they kind of revered the guy. People who work at his properties, generally speaking, speak very highly of him. He's very at peace and comfortable with the idea of he relates to people who actually do things with their hands, work, blue-collar workers. That is a core constituency of his. He resonates with them. And it's sort of everyone is in on the photo op to the extent there's a photo op and enjoys kind of the spectacle. Then by contrast, the reflexive response of the left of this is staged, et cetera, really it just points to almost their own kind of admission and indictment of themselves that everything they do is staged and phony. And so it's really projection when their response, their immediate response is, this is staged, this is disingenuous. Well, everything they do is staged and disingenuous. And so, of course, that's what they're going to immediately look to in terms of attacking the other side. But I agree with Will. What political strategist would say it's definitely a good idea to attack this former president, everyman billionaire, for going out and flipping burgers and handing them out in a McDonald's drive-thru? Why would you spend a second of time on that? And if you are spending a second of time on that with less than 3 weeks to go in an election where you already have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of votes already having been cast, including in swing states, if that's where they are, it shows either A, they can't help themselves, or B, or both, they're grasping at straws, and they're running from behind, and they feel a need to attack and pounce and seize on everything. And I think that's definitely a bullish signal for the Trump campaign.
It reminds me of Lana Del Rey serving food and drinks at Waffle House last year, and how endearing that was to the public, and how it just affirmed, I think, in everyone's minds that like she was the real deal, not just a superstar poser. And so thinking of our conversation a few weeks ago, in one move, Trump manages to secure the working class vote, minority vote, and the male vote all at one time, things the Democrats have really been struggling to do this year, particularly with the male vote. And how attractive it was to see a man who was both like well dressed, in control of himself, but doing something as simple as serving at a drive-through, which I think is some of the most humbling work that many Americans do at some point in their life, be it high school employment or long-term employment. Yeah, and just the fact that it was incredibly attractive. Like thinking of like Tim Walz attempting to shoot a gun with men, and how that just in no way engages like my entire family in South Georgia versus what we see here with Trump, and how, yeah, just how powerful I think that was. So it certainly seems like he hit the nail on the head with this effort.
All right. So next is me and the Bret Baier interview. So this was an interview that happened last week and was very big news when it happened. I think we talked about it on last week's show in prospectively, like why was Kamala Harris going to be doing this interview? And I'm pretty sure I made the call that said something like, this is the last person on earth Kamala Harris should do an interview with, that it would go absolutely disastrously for her, that Bret is very good at being tough but fair, and is just a credible person. And that's exactly what we saw. It was a horrible interview for Kamala Harris. We won't see her appearing on Fox News at any time after that. And I mean, it's just horrible for a simple reason. Like, Kamala went from 0 to 100 on the degree of interview difficulty with this interview. Like, I was actually talking with some people on the DeSantis team, and actually while the interview was being broadcast, but they, one of the key communications people on the DeSantis team told me that when they did a Bret Baier interview, they prepared for it for days. They were, even though Bret is nominally on the right, did I lose internet? No, we're good. Okay, I'm just making sure. I was a little worried that I saw everybody's screen freeze. And I was like, oh God. But no, so the DeSantis team prepared in detail for this interview, like for days, knowing that Bret is asked very difficult questions and doesn't let you just dodge easily. And apparently Kamala and her team were like, oh, let's go from Stephanie Ruhle, who's just like, giving me nothing but positive places, to 60 Minutes, which didn't go particularly well, and then straight into Bret Baier. And Bret asked a number of just obvious, tough and fair questions. Things like, how many, illegal immigrants have crossed the border? Do you think you owe the illegal immigrants who have died an apology? You've been vice president for 3.5 years. If people want a new way forward, why would they vote for you? Any number of tough questions. She had no answer for them. She got angrier and angrier as the interview went on. And she's again doing the thing where she's not a sufficiently artful politician to answer questions, dodge questions in a way that makes the listener thinks that they're being answered to a degree. Like, she just ignores them and disrespects the audience as a result. And so there's a lot of reasons why I think Kamala is doing poorly, in the polls. Like, things are going way downhill. Every poll that's coming out seems to be, incrementally better for Trump. And I don't think this interview did her any favors. I think she looked really bad and reminded the public of why, this person probably shouldn't be the next president. But I'm curious what you guys thought about that Bret Baier interview.
It was so great when she was responding to pretty much every question with why Trump is so bad. And at one point, she's asked the question you brought up, Will, which is, you've been in office for 3.5 years. And she says, well, Trump's been running for office. And Bret's like, well, that's not the same thing. And she goes, well, you know what I'm saying. And he goes, no, actually, I don't. Can you explain it for me? And it was just absolutely brutal. It reminded me of that Trump debate stage moment against Biden, where he said, I don't know what the hell he just said, and I don't think he does either. I think you were 100% right with what you said before the interview, Will, which is that he was exactly the wrong person, because they wouldn't have this plausible deniability that Bret Baier is just some like right-wing shill. And in fact, they still tried to go that route, and it came across as totally disingenuous, because Bret Baier did an interview with Trump about a year ago that was just as contentious, if not even more so, where he was grilling him in very much the same manner. I saw people accusing him of being misogynist. In fact, one of my co-hosts on Rising claimed that Bret Baier had internalized misogyny. I mean, if that is the depth that you're sinking to try to defend your candidate, you know that she performed awfully, and that you're worried about what the voters are going to take away from that. She has had ample opportunity throughout this campaign to demonstrate why it is that her positions have changed, how it is she's going to be different from Biden, and why it is that voters should trust anything that she says to those two above questions. And at every opportunity, she has declined to do it. Or maybe she's just so untalented that she can't do it. Either one of those is obviously troubling for the Kamala campaign with just 2 weeks left to go.
I think this is part of what's led Vivek Ramaswamy, even in, I think, just the last day, to say that if the election were tomorrow, that Trump would win by a landslide. And this is now just building very, very positive media for Trump. Clearly, like bad encounters like the Bret Baier interview for Kamala. And the thing that really stood out to me was that, similar to what you were saying, Amber, the questions that he asked were about the same 5 questions you've heard her asked this entire campaign. She hasn't really been asked very much. She's just refused to answer the couple of questions about the economy. How are you different from Joe Biden? What's your plan for the future? And because she's never answered those questions, those are the only questions she's been asked. So it seems like part of that's the tactic of, if you don't answer, then you have less responsibility to cover a wider range of topics. But at this point, because she hasn't answered and hasn't really provided people with any substance, it's just starting to fall flat across the board. And the laugh, the horrendous laugh that she tried to use to get out of like multiple answers, even on Bret Baier, I think was just like, finally pushed a lot of people across the line. And of course, we can't forget all of the memes that came from this interview. The 2 angry women and the cat, Bret Baier looking like totally out of it and frustrated, with Kamala like looking just incredibly crazy woman, estranged. It definitely played into the worst stereotypes of a female politician: very shrill, unable to answer questions directly, offended when she was pressed for an answer, and certainly is not making any of the feminists or progressives in her camp, I think, very pleased with her ability to carry herself in an even somewhat difficult situation. And it also then reflects on what most people have said working for her is like, which is an incredibly toxic work environment. Everyone's terrified of her, thinks that she's a total moron, doesn't want to interact with her. And then you just sort of saw like all of the workplace complaints played out in an entire interview in a way that I think was incredibly off-putting to the public.
I'd say on the merits, obviously disastrous interview. I do wonder, and I haven't necessarily seen any empirical evidence to back this up, but does bombing an interview like that have the same impact that it once might have when you didn't have ubiquitous bombarding, basically, of candidates' messages and see in your social media feeds, you know, an algorithmically produced and curated view of the world? On the other hand, I do think that for traditional older voters who do largely still consume content from legacy media, an interview like that could have made a disproportionate difference, especially when these are higher propensity voters to begin with. So will it be of outsized importance, I guess, down the stretch? We'll have to see. Again, you know, my simplistic analysis from the start was, especially when you know that the basement campaign was clearly the strategy, basement campaign 2.0, with a protective bubble of the media here, when they had to deviate from that campaign, was that deviation from a position of strength or not? And I continue to go back to, they don't want Kamala Harris, they being her handlers, do not want Kamala Harris exposed to the light of day. She was forced to, I think, compelled to, I think, do this interview with Bret Baier. And that means she was coming from a position of weakness. And the fact that her tick was basically to go to Donald Trump instead of talking about herself. This reminds me to some extent of in 2016, where it was very clear what Donald Trump was running on, strong border walls, essentially borders, language, culture, effectively. A message that clearly resonated with people. You knew what he wanted to do on a few core major issues, and you had confidence that he was going to actually pursue it. But what was Hillary Clinton running on in 2016? I still don't know what exactly her agenda was, her message was, except that she deserves to be coronated because she's checked the boxes on accumulating a bunch of credentials that were, of course, there largely because she started out as the first lady. I mean, she never had to work hard in politics to get to U.S. Senator from the state of New York or Secretary of State, et cetera. So I think you have a similar dynamic here, which is, can anyone say what Kamala Harris stands for, like what her campaign is about, what her policy agenda is? I mean, we can tell you that her policy agenda, of course, is the progressive agenda. And it's just going to be extension of Biden-Harris and our globalist ruling regime, essentially. But for the American people, I think if you ask them, what does she stand for? What are her three core policies? I don't think anyone could easily answer that question. So running for something or with a message versus running on a message of the other guy's terrible and democracy is hanging in the balance, when you've been hearing that same message over and over again, I just don't see how that washes ultimately. So again, I hesitate to say Donald Trump's going to win definitively on election day, and maybe, we'll talk in parting shots about kind of the state of the race and the momentum clearly being on his side at this point. But I do think that this was a forced error, but one that she felt that I think she had to make going in with Bret Baier. And I think it was disastrous for her again on the merits, and the lack of a message, I do think, matters at the end of the day. When you go into the voting booth, if you were undecided, you know what Donald Trump is, and you know what his message has been and his policies have been, and that he's executed on the things he said he wanted to execute on for the most part when he hasn't been sabotaged by the rest of the government. I don't think anyone knows what Kamala Harris stands for. The McDonald's optics and response to it illustrates this. And so, too, I think, is the fact that she has to pivot to Trump instead of focusing on what she would do.
All right, next is Emma talking about Elon as an election integrity watchdog.
So Elon Musk has become the most unexpected supporter of Donald Trump this election cycle, spending a lot of his time in recent weeks campaigning, holding his own private events in swing states, particularly in Pennsylvania, but Georgia and other places as well. And doing so through his America PAC aimed at promoting Trump. So most recently, there's been a number of things that he's done. Most recently, Elon Musk has actually promoted the use of X, formerly Twitter, as a way of overseeing potential election fraud, either now with mail-in ballots or on election day itself. So at a rally in Pittsburgh on Sunday, he actually encouraged people to have their phones out on X, on another social media platform, take pictures, take videos, report instances where they're concerned that voter fraud is happening. So computers acting funny, not reporting their answers or seeming not to report their answers, any suspicious actions or behavior, sort of like behind the scenes, behind the curtain with those who are overseeing it. And so naturally mainstream media, Politico on down, is saying, oh, this is just another example of Elon Musk promoting misinformation. Some of the worst misinformation crises we've had have been around election fraud and integrity. But in response to that, Musk has just really pushed back basically arguing to say that if there's no election fraud taking place, then you shouldn't be concerned if people have their phones out watching for it. And I think this is a brilliant strategy, because clearly a number of states and a number of individual voter locations are going to have people there observing what's going on, doing their best to crack down on fraud. But there's only so much volunteers can do when you're talking about votes across all 50 states and key swing states. And so having just every single person effectively sworn in as a voter fraud observer through social media is actually a brilliant strategy, I think, to one, just put the pressure on people. You have the threat of being under the scrutiny of someone's phone, someone's camera, someone's video, but also just ensuring that in cases where there may be legitimate fraud, we actually have a really good chance of catching proof. Whereas 2020 and previous elections where people have claimed that there's fraud, one of the primary problems is actually getting proof to back it up, and like real proof that you can use in court. So I think that'll go a long way to helping do that. But of course, this is not all that Elon Musk has done. So I think at this point, there's been about 17 million early votes cast already across all states. Typically, this disproportionately benefits Democrats, but this election cycle, especially with President Trump and others really pushing Republicans to vote early, we're seeing actually greater margins go to Republicans than we ever have before. And so to help these early voting efforts, these voter registration efforts, Musk has employed two very creative approaches. So first is he initially said that if you refer someone to vote, regardless of your political party, regardless of who you prefer them to vote for, that you can win $47. And there's no like real cap on that. So like potentially like a great money-making scheme for just like community-minded volunteers. But then second, I think last Saturday, like pretty recently, Elon Musk said that they would be doing a random $1 million sweepstakes drawing for anyone who signed their petition. So the America PAC petition particularly dealt with protecting the First and Second Amendment. And so he was very careful to say that you could win the sweepstake from signing the petition, not from registering to vote or voting, which would clearly violate our voter laws. Nonetheless, people across the board have been very critical of this action because clearly it is connected to the election, and have really started questioning if Musk is violating voter election laws, where like basically how do you legally suss out this gray area? But nonetheless, he has persevered. So at this point, they've actually had 3 drawings, $3 million winners. And the way that they're getting around some of the election laws is each of the winners is actually a well-paid contracted employee of America PAC, of the American PAC. And so they'll show up in promotional videos. They'll encourage other people to register to vote. 2 of the winners had voted. One of the winner hadn't voted yet. So it just sort of ranges across the board. But it's a really interesting strategy. So Mark Cuban, millionaire supporter of Harris, has said that this is both incredibly innovative and incredibly desperate on the part of Musk. But it's clearly something we haven't seen before. And frankly, having someone willing to put this much cash into it. So that's been really interesting to see, just the sort of, again, like Silicon Valley innovative approach to the election. So my 3 questions for you guys, and the 3 things that I've been thinking about, is first, from sort of the legally minded people here, is this legal? Is Musk going to face legal challenges? Clearly, if Trump wins, probably fewer. If Trump loses, he's put a lot on the line. Second, is this desperate? Is this a bad look for Musk to be doing this in relation to Trump, even though it's totally distinct? And third, do we think this will work? And what's so interesting is it seems that among middle and working class Americans, the sort of lottery gambling mindset is incredibly pervasive. And this seems to be tapping into all of the right notes to really engage a larger audience. But yeah, I'm curious if you guys think this is actually going to have like any potential sway in the election, or just be a very expensive attempt to raise awareness for President Trump.
Well, I mean, is it actually that expensive when you think about it, right? You know, one of the things Elon is a master of is getting earned media. Tesla doesn't advertise, SpaceX doesn't advertise. None of these companies do what we would consider to be normal advertising, but they manage to get attention anyway. And so Elon suddenly has, you know, bought X, you know, but by buying X, suddenly there's much more attention on his companies. For example, think about all the attention that was on the SpaceX launch that happened a few weeks ago. That's a product of him being the owner of X in general. So I think the way he looks at it is, well, I could give millions of dollars to the TV stations to run the ad I want, or I can give millions of dollars to Pennsylvanians, and then the TV stations will report on it for free. So I think that there's like that's the basic calculation in his head. And I guarantee you, TV time in Pennsylvania right now is expensive. Everybody's trying to buy a political advertising space. So I suspect that that's the basic logic of his perspective. I think it'll work. I mean, just generally, people like Elon, especially independent types who don't normally vote. He's a huge asset to the campaign, and I think he's helping a lot. And I think, moreover, I remember back in 2022 saying, you know, we lost control, we lost the Senate, and we didn't take back the Senate. We barely held on to the House. It felt like a loss, but that was right when Elon bought Twitter. And I think that looking back, I think we're going to look back at Elon buying Twitter as this pivotal event for the right that took over the central node of political discourse in this country and brought it over to our side, took it away from the left. And I think the downstream impacts of that, I think we're going to see them in 2 weeks with the Trump victory. And I think we're going to continue to see them as long as Elon owns the platform.
This is also happening in concert with the RNC and the Trump campaign taking seriously, as Emma mentioned, the idea of early voting, mail-in voting, registering voters. Specifically in Arizona and Pennsylvania, Republicans have cut the Democratic voter registration advantage practically in half. And the RNC also is running an election fraud volunteer database where they have thousands of confirmed poll workers and poll watchers. They've also employed an army of lawyers that are supposedly prepared to deploy on election day. They have an election fraud hotline. So, I mean, obviously, we don't know if any of those are actually going to be effective and how well they've actually prepared these people to make sure that the votes are being counted accurately and fairly. But it's more than can be said for 2020. When basically the entire election system was upended thanks to last minute rule changes during COVID. So it's heartening to see that they're at least making some kind of effort to make sure that people have confidence in the outcome.
Yeah, I agree. Any engagement, particularly from such a massively influential personality and figure when it comes to the nuts and bolts of getting people out and engaged in voting, is massive because the Democrats have been perfecting this for multiple decades now, and the right has been so far behind. I also just think that it's worth noting, you know, to Will's point, we may look back on it as one of the most crucial acquisitions in the history of the country, arguably, the acquisition of X, in terms of there might be no counter narrative effectively in this country were X not the one relatively free speech platform. Certainly, the US government has treated the social media platforms as the key points for disseminating information. And if you control that media, then you control a narrative and ultimately you can control a population. That's how they sought to, that's in 2020, of course, that is what, you know, government agencies sought to do in helping build up the censorship industrial complex, colluding with and coordinating with and cajoling all of the social media entities. But beyond that, I mean, I think it's worth noting, look, to Emma's point, I mean, Elon Musk is potentially risking everything for taking the positions that he's taken. All of his chips are in, essentially. I'm not sure there's a scenario where Donald Trump loses and his businesses, his personal life, everything don't end up completely upended and having this catastrophically blow up in his face. So he's all in here. He knows that he's the target of foreign entities, of US government agencies, of the entire Democrat Party now, probably of rhinos in the Republican Party as well. It takes a lot. It takes real courage when you are the richest man in the world and you are really putting all your eggs in a Trump basket. And I'm just struck by, just to conclude here, he retweeted someone who had posted video footage of Musk's remarks recently. And he said, I want to build rockets and cars. I just love creating technologies that people find useful. So I'm hoping we get Trump elected, and I cannot be in politics. If America falls, nothing else matters. That's a pretty compelling closing message, and we'll see if it resonates on election day.
All right, Ben, right back to you for the leak of Israeli war plans to Iran.
Right. So in other news, there's been a lot of developments actually in the Middle East of late. This is probably the most notable one in terms of U.S. centric. We now have learned that apparently there was an unauthorized leak of classified documents regarding Israel's war plans, its plans to counter Iran's second attack on Israel, the Israeli homeland. Essentially, what these reports show, these leaked documents show to an Iranian regime-linked Telegram channel are sort of the movements and the positioning of Israel, Israeli forces, the weapons that they might be planning on using in conjunction with an attack and potentially a very decisive attack on Iran. This follows, by the way, something not talked about, and it's amazing the way our news cycles are and the way our media is, that there was a Hezbollah drone attack on Benjamin Netanyahu himself, his residence in Caesarea in Israel. You've heard very little from the Biden-Harris administration about that. Also, Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas mastermind behind the October 7th attack, was eliminated by Israeli forces. And we found out, according to Wall Street Journal reporting, that Hamas's negotiation posture or lack of negotiation posture was driven in large part by them knowing that there was U.S. pressure on Israel to get to a deal, as well as pressure from the Israeli left, oftentimes coordinating with the U.S. government to put pressure on the Netanyahu administration to try and force what would have been a horrible ceasefire plus deal for Israel that would have meant not winning war against Hamas. So lots of developments in recent days, but this week it's interesting for a couple reasons. Obviously, on its face, you have the notion that you have either a massive security breach, which is possible, and John Kirby has been, sort of equivocating on this of whether it's a hack or a leak. The U.S. government won't say. Let's assume it's a leak for purposes of this conversation. Who was it in the administration that leaked is one thing. To what end is another question, arguably potentially to undermine and sabotage Israeli war plans. Could it be that Israel knows that the U.S. administration is leaking a very significant information to the other side, that side being Iran and its proxies here, and this is actually going to out who the weak link is in the U.S.? That's another possibility. Any number of possibilities. We've seen speculation about who it might be, with a lot of speculation pointing to the Pentagon and someone who I think I've talked about here before, Ariana Tabatabai. I'm not going to say that there are allegations that she is the figure who leaked this. I think it might be too on the nose. This is a person who we know was part of an Iranian influence effort brought in by Rob Malley, the Iran envoy, to try and reprise the Iran deal. Malley himself has been sidelined due to allegedly unauthorized leaks of information, potentially to Iranian agents. Tabatabai, however, moved over to the Pentagon after, or at some point when Malley's tenure was frozen. She went to the Pentagon to a senior position, a very sensitive position there, dealing with low-intensity conflict and other issues, irregular warfare, I believe. But there are a lot of people in this administration who have taken effectively a pro-Iran posture. And we can assume that there have been plenty of leaks, maybe directly, maybe through back channels from this administration to our adversaries, including Iran, likely to have hamstrung Israel. It's also worth noting there's a broader history and context here, which is that Obama Biden, when in office, supposedly leaked Israeli military plans to strike Iran's nuclear infrastructure to try and prevent Israel from striking Iran's nuclear infrastructure. There was also spying from the Obama administration on Israeli officials and entities, as well as pro-Israel Jewish individuals in this country, and potentially members of Congress as well, if I recall the reporting correctly. So there's a long history here of seeking to leak, to undermine Israel, to prevent Israel from decisively winning wars, defending itself, and ultimately serving America's national interest by cutting off the limbs of and ultimately probably decapitating the world's leading state sponsor of jihad in Iran. So it's very interesting that you have the administration saying, we take this leak very seriously and we're very troubled by it, et cetera. But meanwhile, it's had a pro-Iran posture the whole time, and it does not want Israel to decisively strike Iran. And we've seen reporting to suggest that the administration has even gone out there and said to Iran, you should really evacuate your IRGC bases to avoid more casualties and essentially bring down the temperature so that you can get ultimately a ceasefire with Hamas and Hezbollah and Israel. So remarkable times, Israel continuing to decisively take out its enemies, Godfather-like essentially, with now the elimination of Sinwar. But you have the Biden administration, which claims it's aghast about this leak, but meanwhile it's been doing everything possible to undermine Israel's war effort and undermine Israel's ability to win. So, interested to your takes on the significance of this leak, the Biden administration's reaction to it. Doth it protest too much? And does this have any impact bearing, 2 weeks out from the election as well?
Yeah, I'm with you, Ben. I am incredibly suspicious of the intentions of the US government in this debacle, particularly given the Harris-Biden administration's attempts to support Israel, but only barely, while still trying to appease the more progressive parts of their party who are certainly very pro-Iran, very pro-Hamas in sympathies or in outright support. And it strikes me too that they would use Telegram to leak this information. So Telegram has been the social media quote unquote source of private messaging where ISIS planned the horrific terrorist attack in Paris a couple of years ago. It was the site that was used to share live action videos of the October 7th attack by Hamas last year. And it's one of those tricky situations where you have one of the safest, most secure messaging platforms, and yet the cost of it being the most secure, safe messaging platform is that you don't really get much say over what content is or isn't shared. So Telegram's website has infamously boasted that to this point, they have yet to divulge any data to any government agency, any government force, even based in incredibly terrible moments like this, right? Where very sensitive information is leaked, or you just see outright horrendous material being shared. So it also I think pushes people to think even more closely about the role of what censorship and security looks like at this point, and having these highly secure platforms like Telegram, while very beneficial for the sort of progressive attempt to call anything you don't like misinformation and then target your enemies as such, it also means that we find ourselves in situations like this where highly sensitive information harming our allies is shared, leaked, stolen, who knows? And there's very little that we can do about it.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story. It's incredible that this person was even hired, right? This Tabatabai person who apparently had contact with the IRGC while they were not yet employed by the government, and that didn't stop them from being employed by the government in one of the most sensitive roles. Kara Frederick, who's at Heritage and talks about a lot about social media and tech and antitrust. She had a point that she held the position that this woman now holds. And she's like, I had access to every special op going on in the Middle East because I often was responsible for briefing the Secretary of Defense about it. And this person is likely an Iranian spy, just an incredible failure of our own, of a Democrat administration to properly safeguard themselves. And I mean, that's not counting the fact that one of the primary guys at the NSC, one of the big head honchos of the NSC, is a former member of Students for Justice in Palestine. So if it wasn't this Iranian woman, it's one of the primary people at the NSC. It's a demonstration that the Biden people and the Harris people can't be trusted on national security because they fundamentally, they've got a hack in their system, which is we're not allowed to be racist. So they have to hire more and more people of Muslims and more people of foreign descent who already have backgrounds of hating American allies. That's nonsense. These people should be nowhere near the federal government, given their histories. Like you work for Students for Justice in Palestine, you remember them as a college kid, you don't get to be in a national security role in the federal government. Them's the breaks. They we're an affiliate of the Muslim Brotherhood. So you're willingly joining an organization like that. Like, sorry, if your dream is to be in national security, but you just don't get to. It's the end of story. But apparently not. And so that's ridiculous. Just in general, I think Israel probably realizes that they just simply aren't going to give any more information to the Americans, and they can point to this and say, guess what? You guys leak it. So, whatever, we're going to tell you what we're doing, when we're doing it, and not any time before that. Deal with it.
What's hilarious too is that as all of this is happening, as for all intents and purposes, the Biden administration is against our ally. We see that polls recently of Arab Americans show them potentially going to Trump because there's still a significant contingent of that uncommitted vote that doesn't trust that Kamala Harris is going to change any of the Biden administration policy on Israel to be even more anti-Israel than it already is, because she likes to pay lip service to pro-Israeli narratives by saying publicly that she's going to continue the Biden administration policy. So it's just a great reminder that these individuals that they're trying to placate are never going to be satisfied. And in the meantime, America's national security hangs in the balance.
Does Emma need to speak, or did Emma already go? I forget.
I already went.
Okay, fair enough. All right. Well, in that case, we'll move on to final thoughts. I'll kick it off. I'm going on Cenk Uyghur's show on the Young Turks in 2 days. He put out a public offer to want to debate Trump supporters. I'm going to do it. I've been thinking a lot about what I'm going to talk about, but I think since there's so many other conservatives who are going to be arguing with him, because it's going to be a whole package of people. I think people like Bongino, Liz Wheeler are going to do it. I'm going to come at it from the angle that's like, sort of joking, but like, what would I tell a 2004 John Kerry voter about why they should be voting for Donald Trump? And I think the answer is actually fairly compelling. The only way to keep Liz Cheney out of the Secretary of Defense position is to vote for Donald Trump. It seems Kamala Harris has made the bizarre decision to campaign with one of the most loathed politicians in America, and decide to bring them to battleground states, including Michigan, where in particular the Cheney's advocacy for the Iraq War and for increased militarism in the Middle East is not appealing at all. And you wonder, gosh, the Harris campaign has just been having one of the worst months I can imagine. I just do not know what they are thinking going with Liz Cheney, because they just don't understand the electorate if they're doing that. For every nominal kind of never Trumpy independent they might think they're mobilizing by bringing out Liz Cheney, there are 3 or 4 independent types who are having trouble choosing between maybe their social values where they agree with the Democrats, but their foreign policy values, where they align with the Republicans, and just shoving Liz Cheney in their face as a reminder that maybe their party is the Republican Party. And I think back at Cenk Uyghur, I'll talk to him about this, but Cenk was a very aggressively anti-Bush, anti-neocon Democrat back in 2004, 2008. And I think I'm just going to bully him by saying that, if you want Bill Kristol to have influence and you want Liz Cheney to be Secretary of Defense, then you should keep voting the way you're voting, Cenk, because I know he hates those people. Anyway.
Well, my final thoughts are that it has just been confirmed that Trump is going to appear on the Joe Rogan podcast. According to reporting from Politico, he's going to record the episode in Austin this Friday. I guess it's going to come out perhaps early next week. This has been a long time coming. People have been sort of cajoling Joe to have Trump on his podcast for a really long time, and he's been kind of resistant to it for a couple of reasons. And then there were reports the past 2 weeks that it might actually happen, that Joe was saying publicly that he was potentially talking to the Trump campaign. Then there were reports that Kamala's campaign was thinking about having her go on Joe Rogan as well, which would be quite the interesting appearance. I suspect that no one on her campaign staff has actually watched any significant amount of Joe Rogan, because if they had, they would have realized that that is just a disaster waiting to happen. But we are finally getting the Rogan Trump sit down. I am very excited. I think, regardless of what this means for political strategy and it happening a week out from the election, it should just be a really genuinely interesting conversation. And one that I think will be really beneficial to a lot of Americans.
Two very brief final thoughts. First, last week, Italy officially announced that they were prohibiting all forms of surrogacy. So for a long time now, surrogacy has been illegal in Italy itself. So renting the womb of another woman, paying another woman to carry a child for you. But they recently just passed a law actually making it illegal with fines or even like potential jail time maybe for an Italian citizen to travel to another country to use a surrogate. So this is actually the first law of its kind that like fully insulates any Italian citizen, whether they're in Italy or outside of Italy, from using surrogacy, which has elicited a lot of reactions across the board, but a surprising number of like fairly positive reactions from people. It tends to like elicit like a weird coalition of like feminist, social conservatives, certain religions, all together under that banner. And somewhat related to this, I've been really interested to see the sort of negative pushback that the Harris campaign has been getting for their religious campaigning. So Harris has been at mega Black churches recently promoting all of her policy positions. Evangelicals that are incredibly critical of Trump and Christian nationalism and like, trying to scare everyone are like perfectly fine with Harris speaking at churches, even though she has like an outright insane abortion policy. And sort of the most recent thing is she was at a rally and these two young students said that just like shouted out something to the effect of like, Christ is King, Christ is Lord. And Harris allegedly turned to them and was like, you're at the wrong rally if that's what you think. And it's just really been receiving a lot of really bad coverage among the sort of evangelical religious sect that she's worked so hard to court. So those are the sort of two standout stories from this past week.
For my parting shots, I'm just finding all of the evidence that we're starting to accumulate about the direction of the 2024 election to be fascinating. You have betting markets now shifting in Donald Trump's favor to historic levels in terms of the Trump margin in betting markets. We've seen I think, Real Clear Politics had a statistic, something like the last 44 polls or so in swing states that Donald Trump has been leading in a majority of them. I think it was 28 of the 44. Obviously, nationally, there's been compression in terms of it being essentially a dead heat, which is not even as telling as what we're seeing in the battleground polls. And then there was an interesting anecdote, piece of evidence from John Ralston out of Nevada. Nevada is seen as probably one of the more difficult states, maybe of the swing states, for Donald Trump to win. Mark Halpern flagged this, a political reporter, where in early voting results there, essentially the key counties, namely Clark County, where Democrats need to have a massive advantage, it's perceived as going into Election Day, that there is not that massive wall there for Democrats building. And in fact, in early voting, you see Republicans voting at substantially greater numbers than they have historically. Now, I'm a little, at this point, I'm, I guess, cautiously optimistic about what we're going to learn from the early voting, because on the one hand, to the extent that Republican voters still vote on Election Day in person at similar propensities to in the past, then obviously if you see an early voting Republican number substantially higher than before, that would be very bullish. On the other hand, could it be that you just are going to have fewer Republican voters voting on Election Day and a much greater proportion voting early? Possible. We'll have to see. It's not clear that early votes necessarily mean incremental votes, but it might, on the other hand, show that there is enthusiasm and energy on the Republican side such that people are banking their votes as early as possible. Also, maybe this is an illustration of the Republican get out the vote effort and banking the vote early effort bearing some fruit, and that might also be a bullish signal ultimately. But we'll have to keep looking at the registration numbers and the early voting totals. There's been a lot of evidence to suggest that Republican versus Democrat registration has gone substantially in Republicans' favor in many of the swing states. So all these pieces of evidence start to present a really bullish case for the Trump campaign. And I guess we'll see next week if this momentum and the trend continues or if there's a change. But one thing that is a different dynamic, really, than we've seen historically, set aside in what we saw in 2020, is you know, to a large extent, the election is already being decided right now in real time, and we don't actually know what way it's going. We're looking at all sorts of different numbers and trying to extrapolate from them. I wish it was not this way, because voters should still be accumulating data and information about what each of these candidates are about. We should still have a singular election day. We don't. We'll see whose benefit it redounds to this time around.
All right, with that, I'm Will Chamberlain on behalf of Amber, Emma, and Ben. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.